All right, here we go. Black Americans have been systemically abused in this country since its inception and even before that. We should be paid reparations as an atonement for what happened in the past and for what continues to happen today. Talking about the dark and racist history of this country can make a lot of people uncomfortable, but this needs to be addressed. Ignoring slavery means ignoring millions of people who have suffered and died because of the role slavery has played in our society. Enslaved Africans were the backbone of this country and created its wealth. Enslaved Africans were the backbone of this country for centuries. Africans were abducted to this country and stolen from their homeland in the early 1600s. The first of many were brought on a slave privateer ship called the White Lion. They were often put in these cargo holds called slave cargo holds that held up to nearly 300 slaves. The unlucky of them were put on shelves that had 2 feet and 7 inches of space between them. They were traded for supplies or sold to willing bidders. Crops, one of the biggest industries in the South and this country, is what enslaved Africans were forced to farm them. They did this from clean day to first dark, which was 10 or more hours a day. They did this for 7 days a week, with the only break being the little time they had to sleep. During planting or harvest time, they were forced to work for 15 to 16 hours a day. They had daily quotas they needed to fill, and if they didn't, they would be severely punished. A common quota for cotton was 200 pounds by end of day. Imagine that, 200 pounds of one of the lightest crops, and you had to have it at the end of each working day. They worked for hours in nearly all types of weather to meet these insane quotas. They tended to cattle, cleaned and cooked in what was called the big house, and raised and cared for their enslavers' children. They also built everything that would be on the plantation. Most built the big houses. They built the slave shacks they lived in, barns, and even silos. They also built nearly all of the most prominent landmarks in this country. The White House was built by enslaved Africans, along with the Washington Monument. They were not paid nor fairly compensated for the work they did. They were not honored for their contributions to American history. They were simply forgotten. They were slaves who were made to work on a house that people would live in and kept them in chains for years to come. Some other prominent landmarks include the U.S. Capitol building, George Washington's private residence, pictured on the left, in Mount Vernon, and James Madison's family home, the plantation, pictured on the right. It was a working plantation for generations in his family. One of the most ironic landmarks is South Carolina's Fort Sumter, where the Civil War was brought to an end. Reparations should be paid as a way of atonement for the atrocities of the past. Black Americans have been systemically abused in this country for centuries. The foundation of this country is racist and has been putting Black Americans down since our ancestors were brought here in chains. Many of those ancestors weren't escaped slaves, but the ones that were freed on June 19, 1865. They left with what little they owned and made their way to new lives in the world now open to them, but they weren't ready for what was to come. Jim Crow laws came into effect just after the Civil War. Their distinct purpose was to keep Blacks and whites separate no matter what, and to keep Blacks in a slave mindset. They were enacted just after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The Jim Crow laws were adopted by the Southern states in an effort for the whites of the South to keep their way of life. These laws were only legal because the justice system was ruled by racist Confederate soldiers who didn't care about the rights that Black people had earned after the Civil War, and they wanted to keep Black people down. Jim Crow laws were unfair and very restricting to Black people, often preventing them from living a full life. Because of this, Black people were incarcerated at an alarming and irregular rate for long sentences, and because of the wording of the 13th Amendment, were put into indentured servitude. The police schemed with work camps to put Black people in there for the duration of their sentence, and most people never came out. They either died there or were kept for 10 to 20 years. In the 1800s, big cities of the South weren't in the chokehold of the Jim Crow laws, so Blacks started to immigrate to the cities. But then the whites of those cities started getting uncomfortable. They started to adopt the Jim Crow laws because they were mad that Blacks were moving there. After this, Jim Crow laws spread through a plague through the country, with over 30 states adopting them. They ranged from seemingly simple laws like alcohol sales to miscegenation, which meant that Blacks and whites could not be in relationships. These laws made life extremely hard for Black people, and to this day, still impact the lives of Black people in the South and throughout the country. Racism is the biggest problem that our country faces today. Racism echoes throughout this country's history and is ingrained in everything it does. While everything evolves and gets different, people's hatred and ignorance doesn't. As a result of the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan came into power. They were a shadow organization that terrorized Blacks in the South. They firebombed Black schools, vandalized Black-owned businesses, raped women, and killed men, women, and children. They were allowed to continue all of this with the support of the highest levels of government. It doesn't help when the very people who are supposed to protect you, law enforcement, judges, are the ones that make things unsafe for you in your own country. One of the most prolific examples of racism is the murder of George Floyd, a man publicly executed by the police of Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was pushed down to the ground and had the knee of a police officer on his neck for over 9 minutes as George Floyd begged for breath. His murder is a prime example of how damaging slavery is to this country and why reparations should be paid. If reparations are not given to Black people in this country, how can we be expected to heal and get through everything? In conclusion, Black Americans should be paid reparations as a way of atonement for the atrocities of the past against their enslaved ancestors and for what continues to happen to them today. It can never erase or make up for anything that happened, but perhaps it can help their descendants make their way through life. Thank you.